Recently, there has been a discussion going on within the Master Duel and wider TCG community. This discussion of course being about Floodgates and whether they serve a positive function within the card game. From this, a channel by the name Stevie Blunder uploaded a video critiquing Floodgates and claiming they are indefensible, even naming the title of the video Stop Defending Floodgates. However, in this video Stevie made several objective errors and made some points that I should just personally disagree with, so I decided to make this sort of response video combating some of the issues I had with his original video.
Let's get started. Keeping combo in check. Well, let me ask you a question. What happens when the meta decks start playing a Floodgate? Decks like Spiral playing Mystic Mine, Dragon Link playing the Buster Lock, Zodiac playing Dimensional Barrier, Geargia playing Shockmaster. These are all historically combo-based decks that, in their era, played uninteractive, not fun Floodgates because of how powerful and generic they were.
This is just listing when combo decks played Floodgates in some combo dominated formats. The goal of a Floodgate is to deal with the problem of a particular combo deck being allowed to do too much. So there's some examples of when combo decks played it specifically for the mirror match or for combo dominated formats. Doesn't really make a strong point against their design here, as they are working fully as intended. In rare instances, Floodgates become a problem for more than just combo decks, but in those moments they are usually dealt with relatively quickly, such as the Dragon Buster Lock being hit on the second ban list after it became a viable strategy, or Shockmaster being banned just over a year after its release. The issue here is specific cards being designed too strongly, but a few Floodgates being purely balanced does not mean Floodgates as a whole are bad.
The same could be said about monster-based Floodgates such as VFD, Appaloosa, and Herald of Ultimateness. These are all extremely oppressive cards that also shut down players' plays, but whenever I see these two camps of monster Floodgates versus trap Floodgates arguing with each other on Twitter, it really gets frustrating to me for why they both can't just agree that, hey, maybe these cards and design thematics are just very silly overall.
Monster-based Floodgates, such as the ones previously mentioned, are inherently worse game design as they are typically attached to big bodies, meaning that you are locking up some of the opponent's plays, whilst also being able to apply pressure simultaneously. A card like True King for Calamities, or shortened to VFD, will just win on its own because it's a 3000 attack body as well as being a very strong Floodgate. Spell and trap Floodgates on the other hand are naturally less oppressive and better card design because they can never win a game on its own. Just to quickly cover some bases here though, there are some monster Floodgates that are easier to outdid spell trap Floodgates, namely being the Barrier Statue lineup, because they are attached to a very weak body that you can also just run over, giving you more outs to it. Just like with some spell trap Floodgates being designed either too strongly or too weakly, it's the same with monster based Floodgates. Just because there are some weak monster Floodgates does not mean as a whole monster based Floodgates are worse game design than spell trap Floodgates.
Yes, MST, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Lightning Storm do all exist as very powerful outs to Floodgates and back row. However, let's take some deck building math into account. Statistically, in a 40 card deck and a 6 card hand, because you're going second, you are likely going to open a starter as well as a way to deal with back row about 24% of the time, rounded up. Those aren't very good odds.
Actually, the maths here was completely wrong, and he later goes on to show Roddy the King as he makes this point, which is ironic considering he ignores basic home and deck building. But the maths here only takes into account of you being able to play if you draw a 6 of normal summon. However, if you want to play an optimal deck list, you'll be playing 14 starters, in which case you'd have a 36.07% chance to see Twin Tristers here. This 36.07% being the same chance of you just seeing Twin, meaning that the amount of Twin Tristers you see alongside your starter is dependent on how many spaces you want to dedicate to seeing the back row removal, more so than seeing your starters. So this argument that it's unlikely you see both a starter and an out is just wrong, since if you build your deck right, you always draw your starter alongside your out.
Master Duel is a best of one format, which, although has its own issues, also comes with the issue that decks built around high rolling with back row exist just as much as decks high rolling with combo. There is no side deck to hard counter these decks games 2 and 3, and this forces people to use their 9 to 15 remaining main deck slots on cards such as hand traps or board breakers, and when you realize that the math splits itself down the middle of high ladder being about half combo and half control nonsense, you realistically cannot counter both.
Firstly, Master Duel seems to be mostly designed to be enjoyed casually, as the majority of the player base aren't actually ultra competitive or even semi-competitive. Trying to use Monster Duel's best of one format to make a point about how a balanced duel format should look is thus an inherently bad point. Also, not having enough tech spots in the main deck to deal with combo and floodgates is more of an issue that combo deck faces and not an issue that other types of decks face. This again shows how floodgates do in fact work as designed and balanced, being a counter to combo decks. But again, Master Duel is entirely built around newer and more casual players getting into the game, which is why it's only best of one, as it allows for people to go through games much quicker. If you lost to a floodgate, you only spent like 10 minutes at most, and then you can move on to the next game. The same if you lost to a heavy combo deck. You do not and are not entitled to win every single game, so this mentality that it's the worst thing ever to have a few matches where you simply cannot win on a best of one ladder just doesn't make any sense. Stevie later goes on to say that you are forced to play Striker or Invoke to fake counters to both, but they are bad decks, which, yeah, that's a good point. However, it feeds into this mentality that this casual space is meant to be designed where you can win every single game, which is just inherently not a feature of the game. This point also happily ignores that literally the best deck right now in Master Duel is Tri-Brigade Zodiac, which is a deck that's good and able to fit every single counter you would need.
Control decks playing Floodgates, such as Subterra and Eldritch, do not want the game state to progress. They are purposely slowing it down as much as possible because their turn-to-turn plays, while extremely slow and weak in general relatively to many combo decks, are simply better than those reliant on decks with combos while under a Floodgate.
So there seems to be some sort of assumption that the moment you're in a favorable position, you automatically win the game. This is not true. Sure, Outlets and Subterra are much better in simplified game states, which is why they are fine to play with Floodgates and benefit from it. But also have to consider that because they aren't typically great at pushing and applying pressure, that it's not actually hard to stall out their attacks and extend the length of the game, which gives you more turns to draw cards that could turn the tide or draw a straight up out.
Floodgates create a game state which is balanced for both players. This would be an argument in favor of Floodgates if both players were only playing control-based mirror matches. That isn't how matchups work in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the long run and in reality. Over the course of dozens of games, the odds you are playing this sort of mirror match are at absolute best 50%.
Correct. Floodgates are not meant to be balanced. They are designed to be an effective counter against a certain type of deck, so of course it's not going to be balanced when you have a Floodgate versus a combo deck, much like how it's also not balanced when you have, for example, back row mover against a control deck. Stevie then goes on to make some arbitrary numbers up to suggest that you only have a 50% chance to play a control mirror, which means 50% of the time your floodgates aren't like balanced or whatever. This is a really weird point because it's physically impossible to check those numbers unless you are Mr. Konami yourself. And it's also a very awful point to try to have in the context of Master Duel, where the majority of the time you're playing against someone who doesn't know a better play than set Whitestone of Legends and pass. Which again leads to the misconception that Master Duel Weighted is meant to be taken completely seriously, and not as designed so newer players can play fast game and experience more of the game to get into the TCG and OCG.
It is a prevailing theory that Floodgates only see heavy usage and are great in formats where combo exists heavily. However, I'd like to counter the argument with the fact that even in control and mid-range formats, Floodgates were still used. Again, look at Toss format where Thunder Dragon Colossus was an incredibly powerful Floodgate that was played, not just because the deck was playable, but because the Floodgate was good enough against most of the top decks.
Okay, I'm gonna start this by saying I hate the term TOS format, okay? Because what the hell is TOS format? That's like 8 months in 2019, and in most of those 8 months of 2019, the format was dominated by combo decks, with the only exception being the WCQ format where the combo deck was locked behind a $2,000 paywall, but was also the deck that everyone was preparing for. For example, all the Striker players playing Mystic Mine were talking about playing it specifically for the Danger Thunder deck, not for any of the other decks in the format. He also implies that Colossus was broken because of its effect, which is a big misconception to be honest. The reason why Colossus was so problematic was simply because it enabled Thunder Dragons to trigger their leaving field effects extremely easily, enabled cards such as Darkest Diabolos to hand rip again, and was a level 8 to make Hope Harbinger or Xenophon with. You know, it was really simpler times back then. It being a Floodgate had almost nothing to do with why it was so strong for the majority of its playtime during 2019.
Look at even last format, a format that had a ton of back and forth gameplay and interaction, where people still played cards like Tikaboo and Striker, Protoss and Sword Soul, and Mystic Mine in just about everything.
Okay, gonna tackle some more misinformation here. Leg Money 1 being in Striker last format is just false, at least in Europe. I don't have information on American events, so it's possible that it was just bad NA deck building moment. But as far as I'm aware, Sky Striker did not really play Deck 21. I think there was like one European list that topped with it, but majority of the European top in Striker lists were not on that card at all, not even in the side deck. Also, last TCG format was pretty much a combo format. The 10E Sword Soul deck was practically an FTK when it was solved their combo, and Tri-Brigade Levelers was a very strong deck in contention. I would argue being the best deck, some people would say it was the second best deck. Either way, F1 agreed that it was tier 1. This was also taken into account that a lot of people were hyping up the Hero Phantom Knight's awful deck as a very powerful deck, which was another reason why Protoss was seeing play and why Mystic Mine saw so much play. This just isn't a good point.
I personally really dislike cards that are oppressive enough to swing entire metagames and force people to deck build differently and be forced to quote-unquote draw the out. Cards like VFD, Skill Drain, etc. These are all extremely unintuitive and unfun cards that I feel like the game would be much healthier and more fun without.
This point is just weird, because it's not exclusive to Floodgates at all, and there's also been a feature of the game since release. In fact, Spell and Trap Floodgates are healthier in this instance, because they slow the game down, meaning there are more chances for the opponent to draw the out or a very powerful card that could turn the tide, as opposed to standard combo decks that require you to out their board immediately, or typically you will die. So that's going to be all I say in regards to Stevie's videos today. There was just a few things I noticed as I was watching it that was just wrong, and I wanted to correct them. I also wanted to apply some context in the discussion that oftentimes a lot of people just ignore or are just ignorant of. But yeah, so that's going to be it. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and like and comment. If you didn't enjoy this, subscribe and like and comment. You can also dislike, because that also helps with algorithms, but I prefer a like because bigger numbers, bigger dopamine outburst. But anyways, I'll see you gamers next time, unless I don't, in which goodbye.